Welcome to Life Happens, where Texans come to protect their legacy and prepare for the second half of life. Join your host, attorney Kim Hegwood with Hegwood Law Group, and our weekly guest as we navigate the challenges that emerge as life happens. Now here's your host, Kim Hegwood.
Good morning to Life Happens with Kim Hegwood, and today our very special guest is Leslie Marchand with Silverado Hospice. Welcome, Leslie, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I would imagine that working at a hospice company during a pandemic has probably been very difficult.
Yes, everything is amplified is probably the easiest way to describe it.
I know that in my practice, because we have a lot of elderly clients, that we've lost a lot, because of COVID and through the pandemic. And so having conversations about grief and how do you cope during this is really timely today. And so today you're going to be talking about the 3 different types of grief and then coping during the pandemic. And so tell our listeners, first off, what the 3 forms of grief are, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Right. And it is a lot of information. I'm going to try to condense it down. And as I mentioned, the 3 types of grief, I'll kind of say just a snippet of where I'm coming from. So I work for Silverado Hospice, and I've been in different roles, one focused on memory care. So the type of loss and grief that people are dealing with primarily when they have a loved one with some form of dementia is what's called ambiguous loss. It's this ongoing sense of loss when someone is changing cognitively as their dementia progresses. And then another role that I've been in is as a hospice social worker that's working with patients and families who the patient has a terminal illness. And the primary form of grief in that setting is anticipatory grief of someone with a terminal illness. The person that's sick and their family are all in the process of grieving in that anticipation, the leading up to someone's eventual passing. And then the 3rd form of grief is what we think of when we think of grief most of the time, and that is the loss of a person, a loved one, and how we grieve once they are gone physically.
It's interesting because I wouldn't have thought about looking at those different forms of grief, and when you said it and you talked about it, I thought, well, that makes perfect sense, because, you see a client that, is in the office and their parents have dementia, and as they go through that process, it's very painful, because the person that they knew and loved is no longer that person that they know and loved. It's, it's somebody different. It's still their parent or, their loved one, but still it's very different, from what they're having before. And so, and too, the pandemic has just made, the number of deaths and things like that, it's just really, like you said earlier, really amplified. And so when you think about those different types of grief, how do you help somebody through each one? So let's kind of go back to, and I'm going to kind of help you so we don't get lost. So we're first off, the first thing I think you said was ambiguous loss. So how do you help somebody through an ambiguous loss?
Right. So I would say as we talk that the coping strategies apply across the board. It's just they're a little bit different and nuanced with each type of loss or grief. So ambiguous loss, as you mentioned, we don't often think of it as a form of loss or grief because we're dealing with someone that we care about who is still with us. And there's a few ways that ambiguous loss shows up. And when it has to do with someone who has dementia or some sort of cognitive changes, the person is still physically present, but psychologically absent in some way. So if their brain just isn't working the same way, that is a form of loss for the person and for the family. So in all forms of grief, the first place is acknowledging that it is a loss and it is a form of grief. And with ambiguous loss, we either forget or really don't know to start with that it is a loss. So I find when I'm working with people, and I'm sure you would probably say the same in your work, naming it as a form of loss and that all the emotions that go along with that are a grieving process is just a huge relief to name it as that and to normalize the feelings as feelings that go along with grief.
So does it change much when you switch to anticipatory grief? Because now the person knows they're going to pass and the family knows they're going to pass. So it's different than the person with the memory loss because they don't know they're going to pass. So
Right.
Do you treat it differently?
Yes. A lot of the coping strategies are similar or the same, but how it shows up is different. So I want to back up a little bit and broaden it back to all forms of grief. My favorite definition of grief on the broad sense is that it is a physical and psychological response to a loss.
Okay.
So when we think about anticipatory grief, it is anticipating that loss, and we're already having that physical and psychological response. So for the person that is ill and knows that, we're all going to pass, just they know that their time is closer than maybe the rest of us in this moment. And the original kind of grief work was developed for the person with terminal illness, of acknowledging all of these feelings, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of going through these emotions of denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and eventually acceptance was actually developed for the person who's sick. So in a way, you would call that anticipatory grief for them, and then their family members are going through the same process. And I would say anticipatory grief for both the person who's ill and the family, the physical response, the level of physical stress is really high because there's all of these questions going on. There's the actual physical caretaking for someone. There's the wondering, is there anything we can do to change this? Prolong life, improve quality of life. A lot of second guessing and that bargaining, that's one of the emotional responses. So it's that ongoing sense that's really stressful. So therefore the coping is being in the moment to be as present as possible and attending to whatever is going on physically and emotionally for all involved. So sitting down and saying, I'm really worried right now. I'm afraid, and having that conversation, or sitting down and taking some deep breaths, connecting into whatever can calm someone and make them feel more centered and present in that moment.
Because I would think that it would change a little in the sense that if I'm the person dying, how you would talk to me versus how you would talk to the family members. Mm-hmm. I think that it seemed like there would be a little bit of shift in the sense of how you have that conversation. Is that true? Is it? And if so, how do you shift that? Because we see a lot of clients that have come in after they've lost a loved one. So these things are really good for me, to have, in my tool chest. And so that's, so I'm kind of really pressing you, I know, to really understand the differences in how you talk to people, because I think that's really important, especially, today, to have how you have those conversations and what type of conversation you have.
Right. And in my work setting in hospice, hopefully I can have a chance to talk with someone who is ill and their family member at the same time. And so if that conversation can happen all at the same time, it is about helping them connect with one another, and process and be able to say to one another things that they want to say, conversations that they want to have. And at the same time, separating that as well, talking directly to the person that's ill and their family members. So for the person that's ill, it's helping them identify their feelings and to cope with where they are in that process. And asking them what is important to them right now. What conversations do they want to have with their family? Is there anything that they want to do to bring closure? With Silverado Hospice, we have something called memory catchers, where if someone is still able to talk and communicate and share stories or share wisdom with their family, we have this process where we videotape them sharing whatever they want to share. And that's a huge piece for the person that is ill, because it helps them process and bring some closure, if you want to use that word, which I don't really like, but it's a gift that they can give to themselves and to their family members. So yes, that's a very different conversation than with their family members. But with their family, it's going to be similar, just a different angle, you might say. What do you want to say to your loved one? What gifts have they given you that you want to make sure they know? And as you know, with your work, these conversations can be very difficult and very sensitive. And we can sit here and have this conversation, and it does get tender. As someone gets closer, it really is giving permission to let go, making sure that the person who's sick knows we're going to be okay. And we will always remember you. We will always have you in our life, in our memories, and how we move forward. And it's okay to let go and move on. And that's important, because some people do hold on, trying to make sure that their loved one and family are going to be okay without them in physical form.
Yeah, my grandmother was one of those that held on, and I sat beside her bed because her big thing, she was worried about Papa. Mm-hmm. And, so I sat beside her bed and told her, I got this. I'm going to take care of him. I don't want you worrying. I know you're tired and it's time. So, go be with, Mimi and Paul. That was her parents.
Right.
And it's going to be okay. We're going to be fine. Mm-hmm. And she passed the next day, right. So, but it just seemed to make her feel better. Her breathing changed. It just seemed to make her feel better. And so for me, that was a good thing. Difficult to do, but it was a good thing that she needed at the time. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult. We have a lot of clients come in. They don't like to talk about death and dying. So you're doing planning and you're like, we don't want to talk about death and dying. I'm like, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about how much fun you're going to have up until that point, so, right. So that's definitely been, very life-changing for me, as I've gone through, my elder law practice. But let's talk about briefly, how the pandemic has changed the way we grieve, because I noticed that it's made it more from my perspective, it looks like it's made it more difficult.
Right. Well, and going back to that statement that everything is amplified, because the reality is we are all grieving at this point. And what form of grief or how that shows up is different for each one of us. And so this kind of brings us back to ambiguous loss, which is a form of loss developed by, or kind of named and outlined by Pauline Boss. And it normally has to do with someone who is still potentially alive, that is either, like with dementia, physically still present, but cognitively or psychologically absent. The other form, the best example is, say, someone that's deployed in the military or even missing in action, where they are physically absent but psychologically present. If they're, off in another country fighting a war and we can't see or talk to them as frequently, they're still with us, but we're experiencing a form of loss. So those are the two forms of ambiguous loss that Pauline Boss outlined. And the easiest way for me to describe and understand what's happening with the pandemic is that every person on the planet is experiencing a form of ambiguous loss that is the loss of the world as we understand it, and the way that we function in the world. So for a lot of us, even if we have a traditional job and we've managed to keep that job, we're working from home. So we've lost that connection to our coworkers and the work setting and the commute, and we're, potentially having to deal with kids being at home. Kids are having to adjust to virtual learning environments, or all of these things are losses. People may have been put on some sort of furlough status. Do I have a job or not? That's very ambiguous. And then the broadest form of that is kind of the world as we know it. Everything has changed. So we're all grieving, and we're all having to adjust the way that we grieve, in addition to everything just being amplified. So that's kind of a precursor to that question of how is it changing the way that we grieve, because it's changing grief in and of itself. And then moving into how is it changing the way we grieve, as I'm sure you see in your work, and we all see on some level, whether we work closely with it or we've had family members or people that we know that have been sick and or passed away, or we just see it on the news, there's a lot of physical separation that we're not able to be with someone who's sick because of the virus. And so the adapting to have Zoom, someone in the medical setting that's with someone that is considered a patient, and their family can't be with them because of restrictions and their own health issues. Someone is having to FaceTime and Zoom or whatever kind of video conference setup to have those conversations, to say goodbye. And I mean, we already talked about how sensitive and tender those conversations are, and to have them via Zoom, if they even get to happen at all, is a huge deal. So adapting if we can, but then there's just a daily growing number of people who aren't able to say goodbye at all in that way. And so we have to adjust and find different ways to cope.
I miss being able to hug people.
Yeah.
Somebody's going through a bad time, somebody's lost someone, your tendency, because I hug I've always hugged clients coming, especially going out the door, and so not being able to, to hug people has really been difficult. And so, because you do that loss of connection, but I've noticed, that, even funerals are different, not everybody can come. And what happens, it's making it more difficult for more family, to grieve. So that's been, it's been challenging, I guess.
Right.
Is the word that, comes to mind. And so, but,
right.
Any last thoughts for our listeners on this?
Yeah, I would say with some of those things, we kind of mentioned broadly that we do have to adapt. And I think one of the most important things, and this is something that Pauline Boss talks a lot about in her work on ambiguous loss, is we do have to find new and different ways to do things. And it's important to be very intentional about that. So for people not able to have a memorial service or funeral in physical form, how do you do that? Do you do it via Zoom? Do you have a small family gathering with just a few people? Or do you set up a place in your home that is your kind of memorial site if you can't get out and go to, a cemetery where you have a gathering? Do you postpone it? And if so, how do you cope? Because we need those rituals. So it's a matter of finding new and different ways to have that ritual and to still keep the connection with the people in our life, whether it's the person, if we've lost someone in the traditional sense of loss of someone passed away, or we're just not able to connect physically. How do we find those ways to keep a sense of connection and community and give ourselves permission to feel and process and be with all of the feelings that we're feeling? Because ultimately, if we push it away or ignore it, it's just going to kind of sit there and percolate under the surface. So how do we cope with it in that moment? And that is somewhat different for everyone, but being very intentional in how you want to do that.
Leslie, I appreciate you coming on the show today. That's such good information and so much. So if somebody wants to find you, because you sound like somebody that if I needed a hospice care, I'd want you to do it. So can you tell our listeners how to find you?
Yes. So I work for Silverado Hospice. I'm in the North Houston office. We also have a South Houston office and other locations that all can be found at silveradohospice.com. And you can also find our phone number or any location. And ultimately, we'd love to answer any questions or be of support in any way that I can.
Perfect. And so thank you for coming on the show today and keep doing the good work.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Life Happens with Kim Hegwood. Be sure to tune in every Thursday at 10 a.m. wherever you listen to your podcast as we navigate through the challenges that emerge as life happens. The content of this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship or constitute attorney-client privilege, legal, medical, financial, or any other professional advice.